afternoon, Dad, or evening, nighttime, my time, evening, your time.
Yeah. Hey, how are you?
I'm good. I'll introduce you. You are Dr. Michael Barnes, PhD, and you are a psychologist, and you work for Foundry. Explain just briefly what you do there.
I'm the Chief Clinical Officer at Foundry Treatment Center Steamboat. We are a private addiction treatment center, and we are a very trauma integrated program. So I've been working with trauma since about 1991 and addiction since, 1982. So been around a while.
All right, and you're my dad. And I am your son, and I am Patrick Barnes. I'm an attorney. I'm a trial lawyer in Lando Lakes, and I work for Spinner Law Firm in Wesley Chapel, and we do personal injury. And so this is our second session. The first session we covered the basics on trauma-informed legal practice, which is kind of a term that we're melding with other trauma-informed areas like nursing, psychology, therapy, lots and lots of different areas of work, mostly in the helping professions, are kind of becoming trauma informed. And what does that mean? And so, and how does that, change the way you practice your helping profession? So the last session we covered the building blocks of a trauma-informed legal practice. We learned about primary trauma, secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, burnout, and then compassion fatigue, and how those three topics kind of meld together. And today, we're going to keep the conversation going. We're going to talk about two types of stressors, which can lead to compassion fatigue and the continuum that we talked about last time, which is this is on an infinite loop, and they're all kind of interrelated, and they are all important, but separate as well. And so today we're going to talk about operational stress, and then we're going to compare and contrast it to organizational stress. And so before we get started, I was looking online, and I found an interesting blog by a woman named Dina Shanker, and the topic I liked, the topic of the blog was, or the headline of the blog was, "Why are lawyers such terrible managers?" And I think that's funny. But basically what it boils down to is the National Association for Legal Professional Foundation in 2010 found that firms with 251 to 500 attorneys lost 19% of their associates in 2010.
Wow.
And the reason that was given was that the work quality standards were not met. It also found that firms with 100 attorneys or less lost an average of 20% of their associates. And you think, well, turnover, that's just part of, cost of doing business. But then they compared it to for companies within Fortune's 100 best companies to work for, which was at 2 to 3% turnover. That's a massive, massive difference.
It's so interesting. The more I read different, articles, blogs, Twitter from attorneys who are kind of at different stages of their careers, and young attorneys are often very concerned about their ability to keep up and to continue to do this work on a regular basis. So those turnover numbers are really astronomical.
They are. And so they cited someone named Jerry Riskin, which is with a consulting company called Edge International, who basically said that most firms are oblivious to attrition costs, and that expense in what they do in consulting is unacceptable. And that the cost of, if you really break down the cost of an associate at a law firm, is thousands of dollars in recruiting them, training them, paying for continued legal education, bar membership dues, malpractice insurance. And every time, when you think about 20% of those people in firms with 100 attorneys or less are going to leave within, I'm not sure exactly how long they're considering an associate there, but that 20% of associates leaving in the year 2010 was a lot. Um, so
I mean,
the point of that article was more business management, skills. And I think what we are looking at is to say, obviously, that management skills are important, but what is equally important is, um, does burnout, compassion fatigue have anything to do with associates leaving the firm? And
like
I
absolutely.
would argue that it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I read an article that said it was something like $9 billion a year is what it was costing the legal profession in just in turnover and the training, retraining, and replacement, like recruiting. So, I mean, that's a lot of money. I mean,
Right.
that's really a very significant thing. And if this article says that most firms aren't even cognizant of how much they're spending.
Right. Well,
Uh,
they're too busy practicing law as
right.
opposed to management. Maybe that's kind of the overarching point. But one aspect that I think managers need to be focusing on, and this is what we're getting into today, is um, seeing these stressors, um, identifying them, identifying weaknesses within the firm, and then applying, various, I guess, self-help, self-healing methods to the firm to try to curb that,
Right.
the stressors. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about operational stress. Um, Briefly, operational stress and organizational stress are two different things, but they're part of the trauma continuum. Um, and so we're going to talk today about, or in this session, about operational stress. Can you give us kind of a good working definition of operational stress?
Operational stress is the day-to-day, kind of minute-to-minute, working with your caseload, working with difficult cases, traumatized clients. And the idea that as we get more and more exhausted or more burned out, as we work more and more with clients who have kind of significant trauma stories, that we get what we call secondary trauma, or we can be vicariously traumatized. And there's a term called chiasmal trauma, which basically means we can be traumatized just by our day-to-day interactions with traumatized individuals, whereby vicarious trauma is really kind of we become uh, traumatized by working with people that we care about and hearing their stories and wanting to be really helpful to them.
And the Operational Stress Injury Clinic, which is the Royal, is where I found this, basically says that this got its roots in the Canadian military. The actual term operational stress injury comes from a military term, which was, quote, the persistent psychological difficulty of a job. And
Right.
they include PTSD, anxiety disorders, depression, substance abuse disorders, and any other condition that interferes with daily function. Um, and so it's
Yeah,
basically,
the
sorry.
military is really, for years, kind of gone back and forth between the idea that it's a psychological issue or it's a physical issue. And the more we learn about the neuroscience associated with trauma and the persistent life of living a very high stress kind of, um, high stress life, that it's more and more being seen as an injury rather than as just a psychological issue. Like there are parts of the brain that are actually impacted by this long-standing high stress.
Right, and Matteo, I can't, I struggle to pronounce her name. Matteo, right?
Yes.
Um, called it a operation occupational hazard,
Hmm.
essentially. If you are in a helping profession dealing with people with trauma, you are susceptible to operational stress, and it's basically part of your operational duties. So it's inevitable. And and so, we're always tying this into the legal profession because that's what we're talking about is trauma informed legal practice. And we found a study that basically looked at, I believe they were Italian police officers that looked and said, why are these police officers so susceptible to operational stress? And there was a bunch of reasons, but three of them really, to me, stuck out. And I said, these are ones that lawyers deal with all the time. Those three things are: one, constant exposure to people suffering distress and pain. If you
Yes.
are a trial lawyer, you are a personal injury lawyer, you are a family law lawyer, a veterans assistance lawyer, a DA, um, a public defender, you are dealing with stress, distress, and pain on a daily basis with your clients.
Also, officers of the court,
Sure,
um,
judges,
judges,
clerks,
etc. Yeah.
bailiffs, paralegals, and again, I said this in the last session. We are not just talking about lawyers; we're talking about anybody in the legal profession.
Mhm.
From intake specialists, receptionists, paralegals, attorneys, anybody. Um, the second one is having to be in control of your emotions when provoked. Which again, if you're a trial lawyer and you're dealing with, um, adversarial attorneys or adjusters or basically, you know, anyone that could potentially provoke emotion, talking with your clients and practicing with empathy can provoke emotion, but having to control yourself, right, and to keep that lawyer hat on, keep the straight face, and be the rock in the case.
Well, I think it's even more complicated when you think about clients who are traumatized or who come into your practice with having experienced a car accident or some kind of other significant incident. Um, they really maintain their survival by being really hyper vigilant of everything going on around them, trying to be in control of everything. The law practice, the kind of process is alien and very much out of their control. And they oftentimes are easily frustrated, easily angered. Things aren't happening fast enough. You're not doing what I need you to do. When in reality, it's the day to day kind of, that's how the legal practice works. And so, how often does an attorney talk to an angry client who's challenging?
And having to be not combative and to be
Sure.
supportive. And we talked in the first session about what are the symptoms and the manifestations of primary trauma. And so if you have a client who potentially was in a car wreck or was, suffered some kind of trauma, maybe physical or emotional abuse from a spouse, if you're a family law attorney, what do those manifested symptoms look like? And they are frustration, um, exaggerated startle response. And so you as the attorney have to keep the conversation moving forward. You have to maintain the baseline emotion. That can be extremely draining and stressful, which is exactly what the operational stress is. And then the third one is, and I just think this one is the biggest and best comparison to attorneys to this Italian police study was inconclusive nature of the work. And so when I think about that, I think of maybe a server at a restaurant or maybe even a nurse who might have a 12-hour shift and maybe had a difficult or really traumatized patient, but then they leave for their shift. They're not coming back for 2 days, and that patient will be discharged and gone. And they can kind of say, that was tough. It was stressful. They shake it off and they say, okay, well, we're going to go in with a clean slate on Tuesday or whatever the next shift is. Attorneys are working with clients. Like I can say that we work with our clients for months at the shortest amount for
Sure.
months. And so if there's a stressful situation, maybe it's a work injury with a denied claim where benefits aren't being paid, medical bills are racking up and wages aren't being paid, that is something that you leave with, you think about, and when you get to work the next day is there on your desk until it's resolved, and that could take months. And
Right.
so the inconclusive nature of the work builds that stress. There is no, well, shake it off, we'll get after it tomorrow with a new
Right.
fresh slate, right?
Right. That's exactly right. And the symptoms that people experience are very much like the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I kind of look at it as kind of three primary things that attorneys or any helping professional kind of take home with them, or how it impacts their job. And the first is re-experiencing the traumatic events.
Mm-hmm.
Folks with primary trauma kind of relive their memories of the traumatic event. And uh, um, when I was at Florida State, there was a nursing professor. Her name was Sally Carrioff, and she said that the difference between burnout and compassion fatigue is that with burnout, clients or professionals can't wait to leave their job, and with compassion fatigue, they can't leave their job behind. So they're thinking, they start to drive home, they're listening to music and suddenly realize, I forgot to do something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that idea that they're kind of constantly thinking about those cases,
Right.
working to catch up and do the things they forgot to do. Sometimes they have sleep disturbances where they can't fall asleep, or once they fall asleep, they can't stay asleep.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Others are persistent arousal. They're always anxious. They're
Mm-hmm.
hypervigilant, kind of. They begin to actually assume some of the same trauma response that the clients that they're working with do. Um, Times irritable, or argumentative, maybe with the paralegal, or
Mm-hmm.
they snap at someone because they're really exhausted and they're really frustrated. In some cases, difficulty concentrating, so that they might make mistakes that they typically wouldn't make because they're so distracted, or they're so tired. And then the last ones are the ones that I think are really important in terms of interpersonal lives, people's intimate relationships, and that
Mm-hmm.
it takes a lot of energy to be in an intimate relationship, to
Mm-hmm.
be married, or to have a partner, to have kids. And one of the things that we see is a real detached estrangement from others, or an avoidance of things that make them either feel anxious, or remind them of the emotional experiences that they had at work. And so a lot of times family members will say, you're, even when you're here, you're not here.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person needs to go home and rest for an hour or so, when they could be playing with their kids. So these are things that they're not a disorder like post-traumatic stress disorder, but they are a reaction
Mm-hmm.
that is very consistent with traumatic stress.
Yeah, and I mean, and having to be present when you're home, to have that intimate relationship with your spouse, or to be present with your kids. If you are thinking about how you're going to solve that problem that is still on your desk and will be tomorrow, um, being able to separate that. And I guess that's maybe a good segue into, you know, knowing that operational stress is inevitable, it is unavoidable, it is an occupational hazard, it is part of being a lawyer, just like it is with any other caring, helping profession. What can be done about it? And I guess I would start by saying it's in the title of what we're doing: trauma informed legal practice. Become informed. Because as you become informed on operational stress, and maybe that's a term no one's even heard of before until now, and they say, oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely aspects of my day that no matter how good a mood I'm in, how much sleep I got, or whether I got good exercise the night before or the morning before, or I ate right, or, whatever the case might be, I'm stressed out because that's just part of my job. And so the more mindful you can be to say, this is inevitable, you have to take care of yourself. I think that's huge, is just become informed that this exists and you are not the only person in the profession dealing with it.
Well, I think it's really imperative that um, um, partners and firms become aware of this as well, and begin
Right.
to put in kind of services to assist. It's unfortunate that the things that we tend to avoid when we're that exhausted are the things that we used to do to feel better.
Right.
And so people, I've worked with a lot of nurses, and they'd say, I used to run, I used to exercise, I
Mm-hmm.
used to do CrossFit. And I say, well, what do you do now? And they say, well, I watch Ellen. I'm exhausted. I go home, and I can't leave work behind, and I'm just too tired to do any of the things that I used to do. So issues of weight gain, issues of other kinds of medical complications that can come with high stress lifestyles. Um,
And I can
and
I can tell you, an anxiety, right? Like avoiding triggers that you just mentioned, that avoiding triggers that will set off anxiety. I'm obviously in a much better place with my practice, having become informed of these things and thinking it through and applying it to my practice. But before, I could tell you one of them is I never watched any lawyer TV shows. I didn't watch Law and Order. I didn't watch Better Call Saul. I never watched Suits. Because I didn't want to live in live in the life that I lived during the day when I was at home. And so, my wife and I started trying to watch Suits, and I just didn't want to do it. I couldn't do it, mostly because they're, it's so dramatized and there's all these like ethical conundrums and stuff. And I just, having practiced for a day and come home, I don't want to spend that time watching a show that revs me up in the practice. So that was a big one for me. Um, so
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. People think, well, my family won't know, they don't notice, and my kids don't notice. But if you don't mind me telling a little personal story about you,
sure.
when I was writing my dissertation, this is back in 1995, so you were 7 or 8 years old. You had asked me, and I will always remember this to the day I die. Asked me if I wanted to play a game with you. And I said, sure. And I was writing my dissertation. I was the supervisor in a clinic. My dissertation was on the secondary trauma of parents. And I was just completely exhausted. And every time it would be my time to roll the dice, my mind would have drifted off to um, my work, and you would say to me, hey, Dad, it's your turn, it's your turn. And I would take the turn, and then I would go right off. And finally, you said to me, and I'll always remember, you said, if you've got something better to do, that's okay. Why don't you go do it? And I thought, wow, that, like, you know, our kids understand.
Oh, they
They're
do. They
paying.
feel it. I mean, it's energy,
Yeah.
and they feel the energy, and they feel when you're present or when you're not, no matter how little they are. Um,
Okay.
so, other than being mindful, I guess, and maybe just continuing with the mindful, um, looking, taking stock, taking inventory on your day, finding the areas that cause burnout, that cause the stress that is day to day, that's inevitable, and prepare for it. And maybe if you're more informed on that this is a thing, you can say, I know that that client is going to call, and I know that I need to take that call, and we'll talk about why in the next session when we talk about organizational stress, right? How does this stress affect the firm or the organization? And by not doing what you need to because you're avoiding, you're practicing avoidance behavior. We'll talk about that next time. Finding those things. Okay, I know that this is one of those things. This is that landmine that's gonna stress me out, right?
Yeah, I think that's a whole 20-minute segment on
Right,
what do you do about it.
right.
I think that can be part three
Sure.
um, um, of this segment, because there are so many different things people can do for self-care.
Right.
They don't even think about them because
Yeah.
they're so busy thinking about work.
So to sum up, operational stress, it's an occupational hazard. It's coming if you're doing what we do, and we'll learn on the next session basically how does that bleed into the organization, and talk about organizational stress.
Yeah, I think the bottom line of it is the difference between compassion um, and empathy is that with compassion, uh, you have empathy, but you really want to be able to help the people that you're trying to help.
Hmm.
And I think operational stressors are accentuated or kind of larger when we really want to help people and that they're really struggling to allow us to help them sometimes.
Well, there you go. Well, that is operational stress.